Well, hello, and welcome back to part 12 of the Penny Family History Slideshow. Once again, my name is David Penny, and I'll be narrating. In the last episode, we had a look at my mom's ancestry and her life in Hungary, and then making it to Canada. In this episode, we'll pick up the trail, and we'll just briefly review my mom's escape from Hungary, and then her arriving in Canada, and then her meeting my dad, and them getting married. And then we'll carry on from there with their life after that, up until the birth of their first child, my older sister, Laurielle. So I hope you look forward to this. Anyways, before we go on, as usual, let's grab a drink and have a toast. A toast to the Penny family and the Varani family. And a toast to the successful execution of the Penny Family History Slide Show. So with that, let's do a cheers. And let's get started. So just to summarize, Clara, my grandmother, in the bottom right corner there, she'd been arguing for years to get out of Budapest. She saw that it was getting nasty from quite early on and wanted out, but her husband, who had a big family and a big going concern there, resisted that. Anyways, things had come to that head. The war had come and gone. My family had a rough time during the war, and they lost everything. And so in 1947, Laszlo, my grandfather, he immigrates legally to Italy, just at the most eastern side in Trieste, and gets a job managing a bank branch there via some connections. Clara, Tom, and Marianne, they stay behind so Tom can graduate high school. They thought that would be useful wherever they land up. Tom had his high school graduation. Eventually, they leave Budapest by train in August of 1948 after Tom graduates, and he graduates with first-class honors, very skilled in math and physics in particular. Clara has to bribe her way out in various ways and through using money and connections, and they have smuggled some money out earlier with some relatives, and they smuggle out diamonds that are hidden in sponges on their way out by train as well. But they get out and they make their way to Trieste to join Laszlo. From there, they all leave to go to first Venice and then Rome. Laszlo, unfortunately, commits suicide, convinced that the family is better off without him, and that's on September 12th in 1948 while in Rome, leaving things in quite a mess. They move hotels to a cheaper pension, the Pension Medici, for the next approximate year or so. Marianne is put in a Catholic expat school. A lot of English kids there for various diplomats and such like. And she develops her English quite well and makes some interesting friends. One of the friends is a very wealthy American family, and they have an audience with the Pope, and my mom is allowed to tag along for the audience with the Pope. They're often off skiing in the Alps and things like that, and I think my mom has a pretty good time. Tom, who's graduated from school, he does what odd jobs he can pick up, but he's not really legally allowed to work. And the family also helps out one of their friends, one of the friends of Marianne and Tom, in the same school year as Tom, and had been a boyfriend for Marianne named Polo Farkas, who got out of Hungary also, and they help him out when in Rome. And Polo was a lifelong friend of both my mother and my father. We visited him many times. Clara has the choice of Brazil, I think Argentina, and Canada. And she favors Canada as a more advanced Western country. And also because Tiddy and Ernest have been there for about 10 years and are supportive and encouraging. Now, Ernest is a distant relative, and Laszlo helped out Ernest when they were trying to escape. Just in the early days, in the Anschluss, when the Nazis came into Austria, Vienna was where Ernest was, and he had been trained as a doctor there. They were Jews. They had to escape. Their first stop was up the Danube, not so far away in Budapest, where they knew they had some relatives. Immediately, Laszlo took out his wallet, and he took out $1,000, and he just handed that to Ernest. And that would tide him over to get to Paris, where he could meet up with his uncle Spitzer, who was incredibly wealthy, who apparently gave him a lot more money to allow them to buy some property and immigrate to Canada. While in Rome, Clara arranges a visa with the Canadian consulate. It's the consul is a kind gentleman who sees the family as well-mannered, well-educated, high class, and it takes a liking to them. They take the train to Naples and board the ship, the SS Atlantic, bound for New York. They wind up in Ellis Island to be processed. Unlike some other people who were quarantined there prior to being allowed into the U.S., they have all their papers in order and all their medical certificates and whatnot. So they only stay there 3 days. And unfortunately, they're not allowed to transit through the U.S. At all, despite having relatives there who would be eager to see them. They're, in fact, escorted by a female policewoman or army officer by a first ferry and then taxi directly to the airport. The airport, they're put on a plane and flown directly to Montreal, Canada, which is their first point of entry into Canada. They get a little apartment there. Marianne goes to stay with Tiddy and Ernest in Hamilton to complete a university preparatory year with their help. Marianne had missed a lot of schooling, and she had to catch up very quickly, and Tiddy and Ernest were in a position to help her to do that. Tom is immediately admitted to McGill Engineering based on the strength of his high school grade, but unfortunately he struggles with English. He doesn't know English. He doesn't know it as well as my mom, actually, who had gone to that expat school. And he can't see his way. The schoolwork wasn't a problem. It was the English that was the problem. And so he drops out of McGill, getting his money back for the tuition. Clara and Tom move to Toronto, and they initially stay in a single rented room in a house on Bathurst Street. Clara gets a menial job washing dishes at Woolworth and eventually moves into retail. Tom reapplies to university after having improved his English, and Tom and Marianne are both admitted to the University of Toronto, I think in the same year, as it turns out. Eventually, in 1950, Clara buys a house on Points Avenue, and that's in bottom right. She's standing in front of the new house right around that time. She uses one of the smuggled diamonds and a small bank loan, and all three live there while they're at university, and Clara's working. By the way, the other 2 diamonds she brought with her, one was a marriage ring for Tom's wife, Margaret, and the other one was my mom's wedding ring. And so we still have that diamond as a bit of a family heirloom. Clara does very well and eventually becomes the head of the millinery department at Morgan's, which was the classiest ladies' fashion store in Toronto. In 1952, and after second year or during second year university, Douglas and Marianne meet. So as I covered off 2 episodes ago, Doug, who's now 21 and just finished second year university, meets Marianne Barani, who's 1 year younger and also just finished her second year university. They both attend Victoria College, and a mutual female friend of theirs, an Olympic shot putter, thinks they would make a great couple and invites them both to a party. And so on the left there is a picture of them up at Wabasheen Cottage that the summer after. And down there on the right is the 2 families meeting each other. That's, of course, Alan and Phyllis, Clara off on the right, and Doug and Marianne. Just to quickly go over the timeline after that, which I've previously covered as well, Marianne graduates in 1953 with a 3-year degree, I think, in history and geography. And then she goes on to get her teacher's certificate, and she begins working as a teacher. While still in university, Doug and Marianne move in together into a little apartment on Huron Street. And that in the top right corner here, that's their little apartment. The main picture over here is at Marianne's graduation, where Doug is still attending university, and that's Tiddy there, who became like a second parents to Marianne. Doug and Marianne, they marry September 9th, 1953. So after Marianne is married and now she's got a job as a teacher, they get married, with my dad still has 1 more year of university to go. So that's them on their wedding, and that's Uncle Mal. Douglas graduates a year later in 1954 with an honors BA in physiology and biochemistry. Doug begins working as a control chemist with General Mills Canada, testing cake mixes and such. And he also begins pursuing a career in fiction writing, hoping to be able to jump over into that at some point. So here's an old photo of Clara, along with a photo of Phyllis and Alan, and this is apparently Christmas time, 1953. In 1956, Walter Watts passes away. That's Walter Watts there, and that was Phyllis's stepfather. Remember, they had a farm up in Richmond Hill. In the interim, they moved out into the Rouge Valley on a farm there, a smaller farm there. He was living with his companion, Grace. Now, in 1956, summer of 56, Doug and Marianne both quit their jobs, and they embark on an adventure in Europe. They're going to spend a year, or just more over a year, in Europe. So they go out to Quebec City, where they embark on the ship, the RMS Scythia, to Southampton to spend the next 13 months there in Europe. Uncle Mal drives them out to Quebec City to board their ship. So this is a photo of Marianne and Doug. And this is, if you might recognize it, this is in front of the Chateau Frontenac in Quebec City, overlooking the river, the St. Lawrence down below. Here's Mal and Doug. They're just on board the RMS Scythia before it departs. Mal will, of course, leave. And that's a picture of the ship, the RMS Scythia. They tour in Europe from September to October. So they spent the winter in London. And they each got jobs, actually. And Marianne got a job as a teacher in a rough East End high school. And Douglas got a job doing the same sort of thing that he did in Canada, working as a chemist. And he was quite impressed by the class differences. He had a lab coat, of a white lab coat, and apparently the fellows without the university degrees had different colored lab coats. And when it was lunchtime, some of the scientists took him under their wing and brought him to the dining room where the university-educated people eat. And so he had never been exposed to those sorts of class differences before. That was very interesting to him. Now, they spent one of the reasons they spent the entire winter there, obviously it wasn't a great time to travel, but also there was the Suez crisis going on. And during the Suez crisis, it was unclear whether war would break out in Europe. And so that was a little dicey for a while. Would they just stay in London and then go back home again, or would it be safe enough to travel around Europe? Anyways, it was safe enough to travel around Europe. And they do it via leasing or buying and then reselling a car. That's the car that they got, a very elegant beast. And also setting up a canvas tent. And they go every place and they camp in their canvas tent and move from place to place with their car and their air mattresses. And after the trip, my father wrote a letter to the editors at Maclean's magazine, and it kind of explains how they did their trip. He's pitching an idea of an article to them. Dear sirs, the time of year is approaching when people are getting out their maps and guidebooks and trying to decide where they'll go and what they'll see on their summer trips. This year, more people than ever before will be crossing the ocean to Europe, and it's safe to assume that thousands more would like to if it were not for the $20 or $30 a day budget most European tours require. This being so, I thought that perhaps you may be interested in using an article on low-cost family travel in Europe. The particular method I'd like to write about is not the rock-bottom hitchhiking and hostelling technique, but the infinitely more flexible and comfortable and surprisingly inexpensive method of touring by car and camping out under canvases. Last fall, my wife and I returned from a 13-month tour of Europe in which we camped for all but the 4 winter months throughout almost all of Western Europe. We did it comfortably, saw all there was to see, and managed to get by, including gasoline for the car, on a budget for the 2 of us that averaged out to less than $5 a day. There are literally thousands of campsites scattered everywhere throughout Europe, from the Bois de Boulogne on the banks of the Seine in the heart of Paris to lonely sites in the Highlands of Scotland, from breathtakingly beautiful spots in the Rhone Valley, the French Riviera, the Swiss and Austrian Alps, to romantic deserted castles in northern Italy. From our 9x9 tourist tent, it was equally possible to explore mountain trails in the Tyrol and the Dolomites, or dress up and visit the opera in Rome or Munich or Vienna, and the theaters in London. Literally any itinerary can be accomplished by the camper, even such unlikely places as Venice and Amsterdam, and at prices ranging from 10 to 60 cents a night. I have a draft of such an article prepared and would be very glad to complete it and send it on to you if you think your readers might be interested. A large number of photographs, 35mm black and white Kodachrome transparencies, are available from which a selection might be made if desired. Thanking you for your kind attention, yours sincerely, D.A. Penny. Well, I thought that letter was very interesting because it sketched out the breadth of their travels throughout Europe. My mom, of course, was quite familiar with Europe, although I think she'd never been to quite as many places as now, but she was brought up with a very cultured upbringing. And my dad was very interested in that culture, and he wanted to be a writer, of course, and was still hoping to be a writer at this point. And I think that breadth of experience was something he really craved for, and they certainly got that in spades. During that winter of 56, 57, as I mentioned, Marianne was a teacher and Doug works as a chemist. During part of that time, he has an accident and loses his eyesight. And my mom, who was a very good touch typist, teaches Doug how to touch type as well while he's blind, which she always thought was a silver lining around the cloud, because that's the best time to learn touch typing, is when you're completely blind, apparently. Do it all by touch and by feel. And I think this must have been a very typical scene. Douglas would write the stories by hand for the most part, and then Marianne would type them up for him with her very quick touch typing skills. And so the automobile they had was an MG Midget, and that's the car that they bought for touring Europe. That's the famous license plate, EAR 203. My dad fondly remembers EAR 203 car, and that's him in the driver's seat. Of course, it's an English car, so the steering wheel's on the other side. Quite an elegant vehicle, I think. And there it is again. He's got a sunroof, popping his head out of the sunroof. Once again, unpacking, setting up the canvas tent. Nice photo. There he is, setting up the tent again. They are sitting back, enjoying themselves, eating cherries. And my mom eating the same bunch of cherries, I think, with the car in the background. There's a couple of photos of my mom and my dad. Some kind of a Roman, I think, ruin. And for a time, they meet up with a university friend of my dad and mom's, a guy named Bob Lane. We knew Bob for many years afterwards. He dropped by the house. I think he was an executive in car companies, and he always had custom-made cars. The factory workers, I think, at one of the Detroit plants would make him a badgeless black custom car with a souped-up engine, and he'd always be driving those around, interestingly. So that was kind of their trip to Europe. My sister and I are very familiar with this mode of traveling, although we didn't go in tents anymore. My dad later on decided that hotels were better than tents, and he said the only place he camps now is in the lobby of the Ritz, he would say. My dad, I think he developed a system while on that road where he had a certain amount of money. Every day they'd write down how much money they spent, and therefore how much money they had left, and they divide it out according to the remaining number of days, and they'd see if they had enough basically to last. And he would do that arithmetic every day and keep on top of things that way. He recommended that Kathleen and I do that when we took our 3-4 month trip to Europe much later on. And we did it. We followed that method religiously, and we actually stretched our dollars, and we were able to stay for, I think, an extra month. Laurielle and I, we went on many European trips over the summer with my father and my mother, and we revisited most of the places that they saw on their trips that they were now so familiar with. We were in hotels, but not first-class hotels. We always found good, inexpensive hotels, and we would always have really good, inexpensive meals, and we would often picnic, and it was just glorious times. We went many, many times. We'll have pictures of that later on. Now, my dad continued to write while he was in Europe, still hopeful for a career as a professional writer. I'll read you one of his short stories that was inspired by the trip to Europe, obviously, and probably by some likely real or an amalgam of real events anyways, that he saw while there. And it also explains his thinking about Europe. And that story is called Belle Arti by D.A. Penny. I've attached images to the side so you can see the things he's referring to as we go. The taxicab was a green Fiat 1100. It dashed out of the Via Cavour, rounded the Piazza di San Marco in a burst of virtuoso agility, and drew up with a quivering of brakes in the Via Ricasoli beside the entrance to the Accademia. The driver smiled genially and leaned across to release the doors. There were 4 passengers, one in the front, a woman of 50 or so, with lively brown eyes and black hair tied behind in a simple bun, who climbed out easily and held the door for the other 3 in the back, unmercifully cramped in the small rear seat. The man was the first of the 3 to come out. He was in his mid-40s, tall, loose-limbed, and expensively suntanned, and he stepped about in small circles on the sidewalk, shaking his shoulders, glad to stretch again. His wife was shorter, but equally lean-faced, and she glanced around in all directions, right, left, up and down, not quite sure of what it was this time they were going to see. The daughter, in her late teens, was blue-eyed like her parents, with soft brown hair to her shoulders, and the fresh, clear, untroubled complexion of the cosmetic ads. The girl and her mother both wore bobby socks and saddle shoes and drip-drying cotton frocks. The girl's a pretty blue, her mother's a smarter beige, and jaunty, loose-fringed straw hats, souvenirs of yesterday's excursion to Fiesole. After shaking himself into mobility again, the man paid off the driver with a foolishly large bill, declining any change, and the taxi spun out again into the San Marco before the older lady, who was about to, could intervene. She was much shorter than any of the others, and in her straight black skirt and long-sleeved, high-necked silk blouse, she seemed from a different world. She smiled at her charges and motioned them towards the door. At the door, the man paid the admission, again with a ludicrously large bill. This time he was forced to wait while a handful of change and a pile of torn and grubby 100-lira notes were solemnly counted out to him. He regarded it suspiciously for a moment, wondering if it was worth keeping, but finally stuffed it into the jacket pocket of his shapeless white linen tropical suit and led the way into the Accademia. Once inside, the 3 of them stood in a group in the center of the hall, looking about suspiciously. The small Italian lady hurried up and, standing to one side, gestured with a sweep of her arm and a proud smile to the sculpture that lined the high arched gallery. She always enjoyed this moment, to stand there and in a single sweep of her arm to carry the visitors' eyes unsuspecting around the room and confront them with some of the most exalted achievements of man's creative genius. She pointed to the end of the gallery, to the great figure in white marble that towered heroically over the room, in stature more like his adversary than himself. There, she said, is the David. The 3 faces followed her arm, blankly, to the end of the gallery and the heroic figure. You remember this, no, in front of the Palazzo Vecchio? She watched them anxiously, a small half-smile on her lips, ready to break across her face and share with them the joy of recognition, of discovery. Yesterday. No, you remember? She waited expectantly for the flicker of recognition, but on the 3 faces there was nothing. The man shuffled his feet and dug his hands into the pockets of his linen tropical. When it was completed, the David was placed in the Piazza Signoria, in front of the Palazzo Vecchio. It stood there for a long time, but the elements, the rain and the snow and the hot sun, they were not good, even for marble. And they brought it here and left a copy in its place. And perhaps you remember on the Piazza Michelangelo, where we went to overlook the city, there is also one. That too is a copy, a newer one. But this is the original. This is from the hand of Michelangelo. The three watched her closely to be sure they understood the unaccustomed inflection of her voice. She looked up at the David for a long time, this object so intimately familiar, and then back at the three of them, her own brown eyes darkening somewhat, disappointed at their unrecognizing blankness. "We will come back to the David in a moment." She walked down the gallery and a few paces to the right. "There are here 4 of the slaves which Michelangelo was making for the tomb of Pope Julius. There were more, but the French stole them, and now they are in the Louvre. As you see, they are not finished, but it does not matter. They are perfect just the same. Like this, they are perhaps even more interesting. You can almost see Michelangelo's conception, fighting, forcing its way out of the stone." They looked, the man at the ceiling, the girl and her mother with fascination at the little lady in the high-collared blouse. She moved closer to one of the great lumps of half-shaped marble. "You see how the man struggles out of the stone. See how the muscles are tense with the effort. You can feel it, the struggle." They looked, the man at the floor, the mother and daughter with growing fascination at the guide. The girl thought how terrible it must be to wear a black skirt and a high-necked blouse, and then, as if to apologize for the thought, she nodded and smiled sweetly. The little Italian lady could not resist smiling fiercely back at her. Then she began again. "These are slaves, you understand. They have no freedom. They must struggle with all their might to escape, for the stone all around them that holds them in. Look at this one. You see, the head is still an unformed block of stone, but its shape, its form is there. It is only to emerge, to struggle out. You see the hands, how they claw at the stone, to claw it away, to free the head, the mind, the vision." The girl with her wide blue eyes nodded and smiled again, as sweetly as before. The mother knitted her brows and tried to read the inscription on the pedestal, and thought that it was a shame that with so many tourists it couldn't be written in English. The man cleared his throat and flicked a particle of lint from the lapel of his linen jacket. The lady in the black skirt muttered, "Mio Dio," to herself, and tried again. "Perhaps it is not such a bad thing that they were never finished. Like this it is easier to understand, no?" The girl smiled and showed her beautiful regular white teeth, dentally inspected every 6 months. The little Italian lady thought ruefully for a second about her own teeth, the obtrusive gold and the yellow cast. "You see, a little like this, what his mind must have seen. Imagine, to look at a great block of marble and to see these forms in the stone, to come with a chisel and free them, cut them out of the stone. It is as if the figures were there, no? And you had only to come and chip away this outside and find them buried in the middle. You can feel that, no? Like this, with half of the figure already free and half still locked in the stone. You can feel it, no?" The girl smiled and nodded and reached back with her hand and pushed away a strand of her long hair that had fallen forward. The mother smiled and then tugged at her husband and whispered, "Michelangelo." You can feel how his mind must have seen these things, how he saw these forms in the stone and freed them, an imagination that can put these forms into the stone so firmly that with a hammer and chisel they can be cut out and liberated. This is a great imagination, no, a great artist, a great man. The mother smiled, the girl smiled. The husband wondered if he could tip the guide with a handful of dirty notes he'd got from his ticket vendor. The short lady in the black skirt closed her eyes for a second. So healthy they were, those blue eyes, empty like the sky, those clear, unclouded faces. Had there ever been a problem in those lives? Had life ever thrown them a question that had not been answered for them, ever once? But somehow they must be able to. They were not stupid. It was there. You had to feel it. There must be a way of making them see it. If only they would look at the statue instead of her. If only they would listen to Michelangelo speaking and not to her. She began again. It's like going into Michelangelo's studio, no, to see these unfinished pieces. But this one, look, this one, can't you see it? How he claws at the stone around his head, can't you feel it? How he struggles to free himself. And here you see these limbs forcing their way out of the stone. It is thick and heavy and wants to drag the slave back. No, but he fights. He struggles. You can feel the great force in the muscles. And here, this is more complete. You see the bands that enslave him and the hand, only a block of stone. With that hand he can do nothing. But the fingers are there. Everything is there within the stone. It has only to be freed. Can't you feel what a great thing to visualize everything in the marble? Where other men see only a piece of shapeless stone, to see in your mind within that stone these great heroic figures, to be able to cut them out, to give them life from the shapeless stone. The daughter smiled. The mother wondered why the little Italian lady was so excited. Why was she so worked up over it? She nudged her husband. Yes, he said, I know, dear, Michelangelo. What was the use, thought the little Italian lady. Could they never understand? Was there a way in, past those clear faces, the empty blue eyes? Could you make them understand that life was a struggle, without kicking, beating, hurting them? That man must struggle, just as the slaves struggle out of the prison of the unshaped stone. Perhaps if we look at the David now, she suggested, as she saw them looking vacantly about the gallery, at the arched roof, inspecting with care the capitals and pediments of the fluted pillars, examining the squared marble floor. They followed her slowly down the gallery to the large room at the end where the David stood. This surely could speak to anyone. You needed no imagination, no ability to visualize great conceptions forming in the mind of the sculptor and struggling out of the stone under his hammer. It was finished, perfect. David, the hero David, even to the sling. This is perhaps the greatest single work of Michelangelo. He began it in 1501 and finished it 2 years later. It was a great work. No, worth 2 years of a person's life, no, to make something like this? The girl smiled sweetly. Her mother smiled too. The father looked up at the David. The heart of the little lady in the high-necked blouse bounded. He was looking, for once. He was looking. Surely if he looked, he would see. How much would a piece of stone like that weigh? The short lady in the black skirt smiled, more to herself than to her questioner, and shrugged. What was the use? You could only smile and shrug. But why did they come? What could they see? Perhaps now you might like to go to the Santa Croce. That is an old church where the fathers teach the children of poor parents the art of working leather. They do very beautiful work, little boxes for cards and jewelry, wallets, purses, handbags. You can watch them working and buy if you wish. They are useful souvenirs and very good for gifts, for the people at home. Florentine leatherworks is famous all over Italy. The mother and daughter smiled more naturally than before. There was a flicker of interest in the blue eyes. Oh, yes, we don't want to miss that, said the mother. They moved off towards the door. Do we take a taxi? The man asked. It is not too far, perhaps 10 or 15 minutes, a pleasant walk, she replied. The man knitted his brows. He disliked walking. And yet to crowd into one of these damn little taxicabs again. He should have brought his own car, avoided all this. They walked slowly past the slaves of Michelangelo, writhing in the unformed stone, and out into the fresh, still shaded street, uninvaded yet by the rising morning sun. The man stepped out to the corner and waved at the taxis circling in the square. There was a solution to every problem. No need to sit cramped in one taxicab when you could hire two. And one of my favorite stories of my dad. And of course, my name is David, and my mom told me I was named after the statue of David. So there you have it. I think they both really, really loved, and I know they both loved Michelangelo and the Accademia and Florence and the statue of David there. So after coming back from Europe, they both move into Points Avenue with Clara. There's a basement apartment. And before, when they had tenants, actually, before Doug and Marianne got married, when it was Clara, Tom, and Marianne there, they had tenants who lived in the basement. So now they no longer needed tenants, and Doug and Marianne, who both had jobs and I guess contributed, moved in there as well. Marianne gets hired again as a teacher, and Doug pours himself into his writing and submitting all of his earlier writings more systematically for publication. And that work starts October 8th, 1957, right after they're back. So you can see he started this little book, and he wrote down every time he sent out a story and who he sent it to, and the date it was returned and the result. And R means rejected. And so this is very, very much like my dad, to be very punctilious about writing out everything, like as if it was a chemistry lab book. He gets letters like this back. Dear Mr. Penny, we found your piece interesting, but rather heavy and inflexible in style. I am returning it enclosed. That was one of the better ones because it was actually a real note, mainly just got form letters back. Here's another one from Maclean's. Dear Mr. Penny, your story, The Engelmann Experiment, was nicely thought out, but, to our taste, handled too slowly and academically. We did think, though, that this was a good attempt at an interesting story with definite Canadian appeal, and will be interested to see any further stories you may attempt. He tries his hand at a TV play called The Cypress Grove. He submits it. He gets a lot of praise for it, and he rewrites it and resubmits it, and they move it around from person to person. And so here's some of the commentary back, starting on the far left, though. This play is literate, sincere in its handling of important and complex ideas, highly serious. These virtues would not, however, count for much if the play were to be produced as it stands, because Mr. Penny has not created a framework of dramatic incident illustrative of his ideas and exciting to an audience in itself. So that it goes on like that. You can pause here and read some of it. I like the one at the bottom right. Dear Mr. Penny, after all this long time, we are sending the Cypress Grove on again to folio. They were already committed to producing a play on Cyprus next season, but are much interested in the splendid rewrite job you have done on your play. Their interest is in you as a writer rather than in the citrus grove as a result, but this is all to the good. We shall offer it to other producers later. Its length recommends it to Folio first. That was him back and forth with the CBC about a TV play. He tries his hand at a novel, and it's called The Elixir. Interesting. I haven't been born yet, but the protagonist is named David. But it too is rejected. And so this is his full notebook of everything he tried to get published. You can see on the top left there, these are his short stories that are written out. And on the top left there is the Cypress Grove and the novel, The Elixir, things like that. And the last entry he made is in May of 1958. And then it peters out. That was it. He packs it in after giving it the good old college try, I would say. So frustrated with writing, and both Doug and Marianne want to start a family, Doug decides to become a teacher. So one day he walks over to Lawrence Park and meets up with the principal, who remembers him as a good student. And remember, they lived at Points Avenue, which was not very far at all from Lawrence Park. And with his honors BA in science from the prestigious University of Toronto, he's hired on the spot as a science teacher starting September, with the promise that he'll complete his teacher's certificate at some point. At that point, you didn't strictly need the teacher's certificate. It was highly recommended. But if you had a 4-year honors degree in science, that was good enough to be a teacher. And in that time, that was a rare thing to have a degree like that. And the University of Toronto was the most prestigious university in Canada by a long shot. So for a school like Lawrence Park to get someone like that, a university man from University of Toronto, no less, in science, no less, that was considered a coup for the school at the time. So he starts in, and he's apparently an excellent teacher right from the start. He tells us stories when the kids smuggled squirt guns in. He would confiscate the squirt gun and give a little science demonstration by dissolving it in a tank of sulfuric acid. He also recounted how he dealt with discipline. He would identify early in the year the loudest, brashest person in the room who would give him the most trouble. And when he came in in the morning, he would close the door, but not quite all the way, so it wasn't quite on the latch. And when the troublemaker inevitably started making trouble, he'd pick him up by the scruff of his neck, pick him up, take him to the door, and toss him into the door. The door would burst open dramatically, and the kid would go stumbling out into the hall, and he'd say, "Stay out there." And he'd close the door behind him. And that apparently kept the class well behaved for the rest of the term. I don't think teachers can do that nowadays, but that's the way it was. And here's Doug and Marianne, one of my favorite pictures of them. This is Christmas, New Year's, 1958. They're living in Points Avenue with my grandmother. 2 teachers now, 2 teacher salaries, no kids, living kind of rent-free, really just helping out. Life looks pretty good at this juncture. So back to the rest of the family. Here's Jock, which is my dad's grandfather. So Jock is ailing, and he moves down from Wilcox Lake, where he and Anne, his wife Anne, had moved up out of Keewatin a few years back, and Anne had passed away up there. And Jock stayed on for a while, but I guess he was ailing and no one to look after him. So he moves into the Veterans Center at Sunnybrook Hospital. Remember, he was a Boer War veteran, and there he is wearing some of his medals. Now, that place, Kathleen and I, we bicycle past that on the regular because there's a nice little path down into Sunnybrook Park that goes right in front of the Veterans Center. And it's, in fact, near all of the family in North Toronto at that time. Now, we have some great pictures because there was a visit from Monty, Field Marshal Bernard Law Montgomery, the first Viscount Montgomery. That was in 1959, and a professional photographer, I think for the Globe and Mail, comes around and takes the photos, and we have copies of them. Monty was a World War II war hero. As a tank army commander, he defeated Rommel in North Africa at El Alamein, and that started turning the war in the favor of the Allies. And he later led the D-Day ground forces in Normandy. And from the same visit, there he is in bed, joking around with the helpers, the nurses. There he is with a bunch of kids. Here he is with a group of fellow veterans, and Jock is there on the far right, looking more robust than the others, I would say. Here's Doug and Marianne at Leonard Lake in May of 1959. So remember, they're married, of course, at this point, and that year they went to Europe, 1956. That was the year that a new cottage was built on Leonard Lake. So here they are 3 years later up at Leonard Lake. This was a 24th of May weekend, first weekend of the cottage year. There's some pictures they took of the waterfall towards the end of the road. This will be very familiar to anyone who's taken a walk down there in the family. It's utterly unchanged. There's my mom and Uncle Mel on one of the beaver dams. The beaver dams are located, again, you go down to where that waterfall is, and then you walk inland a bit onto the farmer's land. The farmer has now built a little road there that connects his cottage on Leonard Lake to his farm, and he allows people to walk on it as long as you take care of the place and you don't do any hunting. Anyways, there's beaver dams over there, and there they are crossing one. That was always something we did as kids. We would walk out to the beaver dams, and it was always fun to cross the beaver dams, which was a little bit of an athletic enterprise, and you risk getting a soaker at any time. There's some more photos of my mom, early spring in the woods. Here's Uncle Mal. He's figuring as they redo the driveway at Cranbrooke Avenue. There's Phyllis in 1960, Cranbrooke Avenue. And August 8th, 1960, my sister, Laurielle Elizabeth Penny, is born. The photo on the side was taken August 18th, 1962, so she's aged 10 days there. And the photo below is taken September 17th, when she's aged just 1 month. And that's my mom there. And this is in Points Avenue, where they lived at the time. So in March 13th, 1961, a few months later, Jock passes away at the Veterans Wing in Sunnybrook Hospital, and he's interred at the Aurora Cemetery near Anne. The family gives his age as 92 years, 3.5 months. But as we now know from the records that I dug up, his actual age was 86 years, 3.5 months, for reasons I speculate on and go into earlier. So my sister, Laurielle, he did meet Laurielle, and she was, of course, a tiny baby, and she was put in his arms, and he held her and was famously said, "Oh, the poor wee bairn," he said, "the poor wee bairn," and gave a laugh. So I was born in 1962, so I never got to meet Jock, but my sister did, although she may not remember it. But the story has been told so many times that we remember it anyways. So there we have it. We got up to the birth of my sister. In the next episode, we'll cover the early years of my sister and some early trips to Europe that they took, and then my birth, and then some early years of my own as well, and the progression of my dad's career and my mom's career. So until then, cheers one more time. Let's have a toast to the Penny family and the Penny Family History Slideshow. Cheers, and see you next time.